Hello 2T4s, we're the Frosh Week Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion SubComm, and we're going to present to you a quick overview of a concept that we consider to be extremely important at Skule, building a culture of consent. This is one of the 3 videos we've created to explore important equity-related topics at Skule. The other 2 can be found on our YouTube page.
Before we begin, we want to take a moment to acknowledge our privilege as settlers on this land. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. While we might not all be present on the U of T campus right now, we all still currently benefit from the institutions that are present on the land. Now, let's dive into consent culture. To start things off, we need to set out a definition of what we mean by culture. Culture is a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes a group of individuals or an institution or organization.
At Skule, one important concept that we value and practice in our interpersonal and everyday interactions is consent. Consent is an agreement between 2 people to engage in some sort of activity. One crucial and necessary application of consent is in sexual contexts, but consent goes beyond sexual interactions. We should keep in mind that any interaction which involves entering someone's personal space, be it physical, emotional, or online, requires consent. Consent in both sexual and non-sexual interactions has 5 characteristics. It should be ongoing. Throughout the whole activity, the person needs to be giving consent actively the whole time. Specific. Any consent given about any activity is specific to that activity. Consent to engage in one activity does not mean consent to engage in another. Freely given. Consent under any kind of duress, blackmail, or power imbalance is not true consent. Informed. Someone needs to understand the full context and extent of an activity before saying yes to it. And enthusiastic. Consent needs to be given happily and enthusiastically.
By practicing consent in more than just sexual contexts, it becomes a natural part of the way we communicate with others, and helps us become better at ensuring that the ways we interact with others always respects their personal autonomy. This is what we mean by consent culture. Consent culture is a culture that does not force anyone into anything, respects bodily autonomy, and is based on the belief that a person is always the best judge of their own needs. So when specifically should we be asking for consent? Consent should always be present in sexual interactions. Consent should be asked before you initiate any sexual activity, including kissing, cuddling, and any kind of sex, even if the individual has participated in these activities with you in the past. Consent also always needs to be given before starting a new activity. For example, someone consenting to being kissed has not consented to having sex of any kind. Consent needs to be given before any other kind of sexual activity begins. In sexual contexts, it is especially important to remember all 5 consent characteristics. For instance, if someone is unsure, hesitant, or their body language is nervous or uncomfortable, enthusiastic consent has not been given. Remember that arousal does not equal consent. If someone is physically aroused but is not giving explicit verbal consent, they have not consented to sexual activity. It's important to check in with your partner often to ensure consent is present throughout a sexual activity. Also remember that consent cannot be given if an individual is unconscious, under coercion, like blackmail, or if there's a power imbalance between yourself and your partner, for instance, if they're your employee or student. As mentioned before, establishing a culture of consent means practicing consent in all interactions. Non-sexual interactions where asking consent is important include casual physical interactions, such as hugs or handshakes, before asking for or sharing any kind of personal information about another individual, or when asking someone to engage in a social activity with you, such as drinking. There are a few important things to consider when asking for consent. Make sure to explicitly state what you're asking consent to do. Do not proceed with any activity until the other person has fully responded in the positive. Do not assume a yes. Ask for consent with no expectations that the other person will answer affirmatively. And finally, be prepared for any answer, including and most importantly, no.
You might be thinking, asking someone's permission to shake their hand is kind of awkward, or at least uncomfortable. And that is a completely valid reaction. We're often not really used to asking people for permission to do these kinds of things. A big reason for that is rejection. The minute we ask someone if something's okay, It opens the possibility for them to say no. Imagine that you ask to shake someone's hand and they respond, no. It's a bit jarring to imagine, and in reality, it's entirely possible that your initial reaction might be feeling a bit guilty, confused, wounded, and/or angry. However, living in a consent culture would normalize the experience of rejection and help us to see that it is every person's right to say no when they want to. If we think back to the handshaking situation, the alternative in a non-consensual culture is that the person is expected to shake your hand, even when they don't want to. Clearly, that isn't an ideal situation. Dealing with rejection is a huge part of understanding consent culture. Rejection, especially in sensitive sexual situations, is an incredibly uncomfortable experience. Often, it pushes us into our panic zone, which can sometimes lead us to physically or emotionally lash out at ourselves and others in unhealthy ways.
When someone says no, it's important to respond in a way that respects and validates their response. First, don't react in such a way that might make that person feel guilty or uncomfortable. The best way to handle a no in the moment is to accept the person's response and move on without judgment or questioning. That being said, make sure to take some time to reflect on the situation. If you realize you may have said or done something to make a person feel unsafe or uncomfortable, make sure you take accountability for your actions and apologize in a non-guilt-inducing way. Finally, remember that it's okay to feel rejection after a no. However, it is also incredibly important that these negative feelings you may be experiencing do not impact the other person. If you are having trouble managing your emotions after someone has responded with a no, take a moment to recognize what you're feeling is rejection, and it is not their fault. If necessary, take some space from the individual, again in a non-guilt-inducing manner, to process these emotions. The most important thing to remember is that everyone is entitled to say no whenever they want, to whatever they want, and no one owes anyone an explanation for why they're saying no. It's really important that you don't pressure someone to explain why they've said no to something.
So what does consent look like in our everyday interactions at school? Some important situations to ask for consent at U of T Engineering include when asking someone to participate in school activities with you, such as drinking at SUDS. Despite engineering having a strong drinking culture, it's important to remember that drinking is not necessary to being a part of school, and to not make anyone feel like they're missing out for not wanting to participate in drinking events. Again, remember to ask for consent before any physical interactions, including hugs and handshakes. It's also important to remember to ask consent before requesting that someone share personal information with you, or before sharing someone else's personal information. For instance, don't pressure someone to tell you what their grade was on an exam. Also, if someone shares their mark with you, you need to get their consent before sharing it with anyone else. Again, remember that if someone says no to any of these things, they do not need to tell you why. It's important to respect someone's response and move on.
It's important to remember that consent culture goes beyond just physical interactions. There are many ways we can continue to practice consent culture in our online lives, which is especially important to remember as most of our interactions this semester remain in the online space. Here are a few ways we can continue to practice consent culture online. The first is to always give people the choice of turning on their mics or videos on video calls. The second is to always get permission from every single person on a video call before screenshotting or recording a video call or chat. It's also important to get people's permission before posting their images online on any platform. Finally, if you're planning on having heavy and potentially triggering conversations with people in an online setting, make sure there's a way they can opt out of the call or chat at any time, during, before, or after the conversation. It's important to remember that some people might not feel comfortable saying no on a call or in a chat where there are other people present. This is why it's important to always have some sort of private channel where people can contact you to say no. For instance, when asking to record a call, remind people that they can DM you if you feel any discomfort. Here are some important resources for learning more about consent and consent culture. The Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Center on the U of T campus, their Understanding Consent page, Campus Police, the Community Safety Office, the Health and Wellness Center, the Center for International Experience, the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office, and the University Chaplains.
All right, everyone, thank you for watching. Remember that we have 2 more videos available to watch on our YouTube account, one on sexual and gender diversity, and one on anti-racism and cultural sensitivity. Make sure to check them out. Have a great Frosh week.